8th of June 1940, the Norwegian Sea. The aircraft carrier HMS Glorious is about to face the one enemy she is least ready to meet. She steams for home through a bright, clear afternoon at 17 knots, with no aircraft in the sky above her, none ready on her deck, and no lookout in her crow's nest, when two German battleships lift over the horizon and begin to close at speed. Over the next 2.5 hours, she and her two escorting destroyers will be hunted down and destroyed by gunfire alone, in the only action of the Second World War in which surface ships caught and sank a fleet carrier on the open sea. These are the origins of HMS Glorious, the campaign that placed her alone in the path of two German battleships, and the afternoon that became one of the Royal Navy's darkest and most disputed defeats. Glorious was, in effect, two different ships built inside the same hull 20 years apart. She began as a battlecruiser, and a strange one at that. In the middle of the First World War, the first Sea Lord, Admiral Sir John Fisher, wanted fast and powerful ships for a scheme he called the Baltic Project, a plan to carry the war directly to Germany's Baltic coast. A wartime rule forbade him from laying down anything larger than a light cruiser, so Fisher built ships that carried the guns of a battlecruiser on the armour of a light cruiser. Glorious and her two sisters, Courageous and Furious, were the result. They were fast, lightly built, and so unconventional that the fleet mocked them with the names Outrageous and Spurious. Glorious earned a nickname of her own. They called her Laborious. She was laid down at Harland and Wolff in Belfast on May 1st, 1915, launched the following April, and completed late in 1916. As built, she ran 786 feet 9 inches from bow to stern, displaced around 22,000 tons at full load, and carried 4 15-inch guns in 2 great twin turrets. She fought in the North Sea, fired her guns at the Second Battle of Heligoland Bight in 1917, and was present at the end of the war to watch the German High Seas Fleet steam into captivity. When the war ended, a battlecruiser with the armour of a cruiser was a ship with no clear purpose. What saved her was the Washington Naval Treaty, which forced the Royal Navy to scrap old capital ships, but allowed it to convert some of that tonnage into a new kind of warship, the aircraft carrier. Glorious had the two things a carrier most needed, a long hull and high speed, and from 1924, she was rebuilt from the main deck up. Everything above was stripped away. In its place went a 2-story hangar, each level 16 feet high and 550 feet long, with a full flight deck laid across the top. She emerged with an unusual feature, a second and shorter flying off deck set below and forward of the main one, opening straight out of the upper hangar. The idea was that fighters could launch from the lower deck while other aircraft recovered on the upper, speeding the whole cycle of flying on and off. Within a decade, it was obsolete, because the new monoplane fighters were too heavy and needed too long a run to use it. Her old 15-inch turrets were lifted out and placed in storage, and there is a quiet piece of history in what became of them. They sat in a depot for 20 years until the Second World War, when they were taken out again and fitted to HMS Vanguard, the last battleship the world would ever build. The guns that began on a First World War battlecruiser ended their lives on the final British battleship, and in between, the ship that had carried them became a carrier and went to the bottom of the Norwegian Sea. Rebuilt, Glorious could make 30 knots, mounted 16 4.7-inch dual-purpose guns, and carried up to 48 aircraft. She recommissioned in February 1930 and spent most of the next decade with the Mediterranean fleet. It was not an untroubled career. In April 1931, in thick fog off Gibraltar, she rammed the French liner Florida amidships. One of her own men was killed, and 24 died aboard the liner. It was the kind of accident that fastens a faint reputation for bad luck to a ship, and Glorious never quite shook it. When the Second World War began, Glorious was sent first to the Indian Ocean to hunt the German raider Graf Spee, then recalled home in the spring of 1940 for the campaign in Norway. By then, she carried a problem that had nothing to do with the enemy. She was an unhappy ship, and the unhappiness ran from the top. Her captain was Guy Doyley Hughes. He was a genuine hero of the First World War, a submarine commander whose exploits, among them a one-man raid ashore in the Sea of Marmara, had made his name legendary in the Navy. But he was a submariner, not an aviator, and he had never truly mastered the business of carrier aviation. He ran Glorious with a temper and a rigidity that earned fear rather than respect, and in the spring of 1940, that temper collided with the one man aboard, best placed to know what the ship's aircraft could and could not do. That man was Commander J.B. Heath, the senior airman on board, responsible for Glorious's flying. D'Oyly Hughes ordered a strike against targets ashore in Norway. Heath refused to carry it out, on the professional grounds that the targets were poorly defined, and his aircraft, slow swordfish biplanes and Sea Gladiators, were the wrong tools for the task and would be thrown away for nothing. To a captain like D'Oyly Hughes, this was not advice, but insubordination. He put Heath ashore at Scapa Flow to face court-martial, and Glorious sailed for Norway without her senior aviator, and with a wound running through her command that had not healed. That conflict sits at the center of the argument that has gone on ever since about why Glorious died. By the start of June 1940, the Norwegian campaign was lost and Britain was pulling out. The evacuation was called Operation Alphabet, and it was happening at the same time as the far more famous evacuation at Dunkirk, which is part of why it is so little remembered. Glorious's task was to help bring home the RAF fighter squadrons that had been fighting in Norway, aircraft far too valuable to abandon with the Battle of Britain only weeks away. What followed was, in its own right, one of the most remarkable feats of the war. On the afternoon of 7th June, 10 Gloucester Gladiator biplanes of 263 Squadron flew out and landed aboard. Then the Hurricanes of 46 Squadron came. Hurricanes were modern monoplane fighters, fast and heavy, with no arrestor hooks and no business landing on a carrier at all. It had never been done. The pilots worked out that a 15-pound sandbag placed in the tail let them jam on full brakes the instant they touched down without tipping onto their noses, and one after another they brought their Hurricanes down onto Glorious's deck without losing a single aircraft. It was the first time high-performance monoplanes had ever landed on a carrier. Within 24 hours, almost all of those pilots would be dead, and the aircraft they had so brilliantly saved would be at the bottom of the sea. At 3 in the morning on the 8th of June, Glorious and 2 escorting destroyers, Ardent and Acasta, detached from the main carrier force and set off independently for Scapa Flow. The reason she was allowed to proceed alone is the first of the disaster's unanswered questions. The official explanation, released after the war, was that Glorious was short of fuel and was sent ahead on a route that was normally safe. The Navy's own official historian, Captain Stephen Roskill, came to a darker conclusion. Drawing on the testimony of Commander Heath himself, Roskill argued that the court-martial was still hanging unresolved when Glorious left the fleet, and that D'Oyly Hughes detached his ship and raced for home ahead of the others, because he was impatient to get back to harbour and see that court-martial through against his own officer. The fuel account has never satisfied everyone. Winston Churchill himself, writing later, called it not convincing. Whatever the reason, Glorious set off across the Norwegian Sea by herself, and in a state of readiness that would prove fatal. What no one in the British force knew was that the German Navy had put to sea. The operation was called Juno, and it was led by Admiral Wilhelm Marschall with a powerful force, the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, and 4 destroyers. They had come out to attack the British base at Harstad and break up the evacuation, and by the morning of the 8th of June, they had already sunk a tanker, a trawler, and the empty troopship Orama. Marschall then sent Hipper and the destroyers to refuel at Trondheim, and the 2 battleships steamed on alone, hunting for more. These were dangerous ships. Each carried 9 11-inch guns, could make better than 30 knots, and displaced around 38,000 tons at full load. Against an enemy battleship, they were lightly gunned, the 11-inch being smaller than the guns of most of their rivals. Against an aircraft carrier that could not fly, they were overwhelming. A few minutes before 3:45 in the afternoon, a lookout high on Scharnhorst spotted smoke and then a mast nearly 30 miles away. It was Glorious. The German ships turned toward her and worked up to full speed. Around 4 o'clock, the British finally saw the 2 ships closing. Glorious sent Ardent ahead to investigate, and then did almost nothing more. She did not turn away. She had no aircraft aloft to scout, none ready on deck to strike or to run, and no lookout in the crow's nest from which the Germans might have been seen sooner. Not until 20 minutes past 4 did she order action stations and begin, far too late, to range 5 swordfish onto the flight deck. At 27 minutes past 4, Scharnhorst opened fire on Ardent at about 16,000 yards. The destroyer laid smoke, turned in, and fired her torpedoes, scoring a single hit with her 4.7-inch guns before the German secondary batteries began to tear her apart. Then Scharnhorst shifted her fire to Glorious. The range was enormous, more than 26,000 yards, close to 15 miles, a distance so great the gunners had to allow for the curvature of the Earth. On her third salvo, scarcely 6 minutes after she began, Scharnhorst hit. It was one of the longest-range gunnery hits ever made by one moving ship against another, and for Glorious, it was catastrophic. The 11-inch shell struck the forward flight deck and burst in the upper hangar, destroying the swordfish being readied there, and tearing a hole in the deck that meant no aircraft could take off at all. Whatever faint chance she had of getting a strike into the air ended in that moment. Splinters punched into a boiler casing, and her speed began to fall. A little before 5 o'clock, a second shell struck the homing beacon above the bridge and killed or wounded Captain Doyley Hughes and most of the men around him. The captain, whose decisions had carried Glorious to this place, did not live to see the end of it. For a time, the smoke laid by the destroyers screened the carrier, and the German gunners lost sight of her between roughly 5 o'clock and 20 past. It was the only respite she had. At 20 minutes past 5, a shell found her center engine room. Her speed fell away. She began a slow circle to port, and she took on a list. 5 minutes later, HMS Ardent went down, her work of laying smoke and firing torpedoes done to the last, leaving a single survivor. What happened next is the part of the story that deserves to be remembered as clearly as the failure that preceded it. The second destroyer, Acasta, under Commander Charles Glassford, had every reason to run. Her captain chose instead to attack. Acasta turned back through her own smoke, straight toward the two battleships, and fired her torpedoes. At 34 minutes past 5, one of them struck Scharnhorst abreast her rear turret. The explosion let in some 2,500 tons of water, knocked out the turret, disabled a propeller shaft, and killed 48 German sailors. It was the single most important blow struck by any British ship that day, and it forced Scharnhorst to break off and turn for Trondheim and weeks of repair. Acasta was riddled by German fire and sank at around 20 past 6, her guns still firing as she went down. She too left one survivor. Between those two destroyer losses, at 10 minutes past 6, Glorious herself rolled over and sank. Around 900 men were thought to have got off her alive. The battle was the smaller part of the dying. The greater part came afterward, in the water. The German ships, with Scharnhorst damaged and Marshall unaware whether other British forces were near, did not stop to pick up survivors. They turned away, and the men of Glorious, Ardent, and Acasta were left in the freezing Norwegian Sea, on rafts and floats and wreckage, with no one coming. The Admiralty had not received a clear distress signal from Glorious. It learned that 3 of its ships had been sunk only when the news was broadcast on German radio. In the meantime, the British shore stations went on transmitting routine orders to the 3 dead ships, calling to men who were already gone or dying. The survivors waited in the water for nearly 3 days. Most did not last. When Norwegian merchant ships at last came upon them and pulled them out, the numbers told the whole story. Of more than 1,500 men aboard the 3 ships, around 40 came home alive. The dead numbered 1,207 from Glorious, 160 from Acasta, and 152 from Ardent. It was a heavier loss of life than almost any other British naval disaster of the war, and a great many of those men had survived the guns only to die of cold and exhaustion in the days that followed, because no rescue ever came. A defeat of this scale demanded answers, and from the beginning, the answers were withheld. The Board of Inquiry was held within days of the survivors' return, and its findings were sealed. Questions were raised in Parliament within weeks and waved away in the name of wartime secrecy. When a brief official account finally appeared in 1946, it offered the explanation that has been argued over ever since, that Glorious had sailed alone because she was short of fuel, on a route that was normally safe, and had simply met the enemy at the worst possible moment. There are 2 great problems with letting that stand as the whole truth. The first is the question of why Glorious was so completely unready. A warship steaming through waters where enemy heavy ships were known to be at large, in perfect visibility, with no aircraft scouting, none ready to launch, no lookout in the crow's nest, and her crew not at action stations, was not a ship that had merely run out of luck. That state of unreadiness is what turned a dangerous encounter into a massacre, and it points back to the command of D'Oyly Hughes and the unhappy ship he ran. Captain Roskill, the Navy's own historian, argued from Commander Heath's testimony that the haste to sail home independently was bound up with the captain's determination to court-martial his own officer. The Admiralty's full account and Roskill's account of a dysfunctional command do not sit easily together, and the documents that might settle it were sealed for a century. The second question is the one that has never been answered at all. As Glorious was dying, the heavy cruiser HMS Devonshire was steaming home not far away, within perhaps 30 to 50 miles of the battle. Devonshire was carrying the King of Norway, his family, and his government to safety in Britain, under strict orders to keep radio silence. Officially, Devonshire received only a corrupted, partial signal from Glorious, too garbled to act on, and held her silence until the next day. But Devonshire's signal logs did not survive, and over the years, survivors and crew members offered testimony suggesting the message may have been clearer than was ever admitted, and that it was deliberately set aside so that the cruiser and her royal passengers could slip away. Whether a usable distress signal was sent and suppressed, or never properly received at all, cannot now be proven either way. What can be said is that the nearest British ship to the battle did not turn back, and the men in the water waited 3 days for a rescue that the Royal Navy did not even know to send. There was one more failure, further up the chain. After the war, it emerged that codebreakers at Bletchley Park had predicted, from the pattern of German signals, that heavy ships were about to break out. The warning was not believed by those who assessed it, and the home fleet was never told. The German squadron that found Glorious came out into a sea where the British had been given the chance to expect it, and had let the chance pass. Scharnhorst limped into Trondheim with Acasta's torpedo damage and spent weeks under repair, the one concrete price the Germans paid for the day. For the Royal Navy, the cost was a fleet carrier, 2 destroyers, 2 RAF fighter squadrons, saved from Norway only to be lost at sea, and more than 1,500 men. The loss of Glorious has never carried the place in memory it deserves, buried as it was beneath the drama of Dunkirk, sealed behind a board of inquiry, and softened by an official story of bad luck and low fuel. But the bare facts are not softened by anything. A fast, modern carrier was caught alone and unprepared in clear daylight, sunk by ships she should have seen coming, and her people were left to die in the water, while the navy that lost them heard nothing. The men of Ardent and Acasta turned and fought 2 battleships to buy time that the carrier behind them could not use, and they did it knowing what it would cost. More than 80 years later, the key records remain sealed until 2041, and the Royal Navy has never fully explained how its only fleet carrier lost to surface guns came to be caught alone and unready on that bright afternoon. But the men who waited 3 days in that freezing water did not die for want of an explanation. They died for want of the one thing a warship is never supposed to be: unprepared. Whatever the documents say when they are finally opened, that much is already on the record.